Is the Gaza ceasefire actually working? ZS? The question on everyone's mind as we enter the fourth month of what was supposed to be a comprehensive peace agreement. Since October 2025, over 500 Palestinians have been killed during this so-called ceasefire. Israeli forces maintain control over more than half of Gaza, and just last week, the White House announced the start of Phase 2, transition to demilitarization and reconstruction, even as strikes continue to hit civilian areas. So what's really happening with the Gaza ceasefire? Where do negotiations actually stand? And is there any realistic path forward? To understand where we are today, we need to start with where we've been. On October 8, 2025, President Donald Trump announced that Israel and Hamas had reached a ceasefire agreement. This was the first phase of what he called a 20-point comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. The ceasefire officially began 2 days later. On October 10, 2025, after more than 2 years of devastating war that had killed over 70,000 Palestinians, the announcement was celebrated around the world. International leaders praised it. Some even nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Finally, it seemed, there was hope for an end to the bloodshed. The plan was carefully structured in 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 would focus on the immediate priorities: stopping the fighting, releasing all hostages held by Hamas, exchanging thousands of Palestinian prisoners, partially withdrawing Israeli forces from Gaza, the dramatically increasing humanitarian aid to the desperate civilian population. Phase 2 would tackle the harder issues: demilitarizing Gaza by collecting weapons from Hamas and other armed groups, establishing a new technocratic government that would replace Hamas's rule, beginning the massive task of rebuilding Gaza's destroyed infrastructure. Phase 3 would create a long-term peace framework and work toward normalization between Israelis and Palestinians. Mediators from Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey worked tirelessly to broker the deal, shuttling between the parties and helping bridge seemingly impossible gaps. But from the very first day, the reality on the ground has looked very different from what was written on paper. The gap between what was promised in those negotiations and what has actually been delivered has raised serious questions about whether this ceasefire can hold, whether it's even really a ceasefire at all, and what comes next for the millions of people whose lives hang in the balance. Let's start with Phase 1, which was supposed to last from October through January and set the foundation for everything that would come after. The promises made in this phase were clear and specific, designed to address the most urgent humanitarian needs while building trust between the warring parties. According to the agreement, Hamas was required to release all living hostages within 72 hours of Israeli forces withdrawing to pre-designated lines within Gaza, something called the Yellow Line. This boundary was meant to separate Hamas-controlled territory from areas under Israeli military control. In exchange for the hostages, Israel would release 2,000 Palestinian prisoners from its jails, including 250 who were serving life sentences for serious offenses. The deal also called for a massive increase in humanitarian aid, with 600 trucks entering Gaza every single day to bring food, medicine, water, and other essential supplies to a population on the brink of starvation. The Rafah crossing with Egypt, which had been closed during the war, was supposed to reopen immediately. Israeli forces were to pull back from most of Gaza, leaving only limited areas under their control. So what actually happened? The good news is that the hostage releases did occur as planned. All living hostages were freed and returned to Israel. Through January 2026, Hamas also worked to recover and return the remains of deceased hostages who had died during captivity. On January 27th, the body of the last Israeli captive, Ran Givili, was recovered and returned to Israel for burial, allowing his family to finally have closure. The prisoner exchanges also took place as agreed, with Palestinian prisoners released in stages. These were real achievements that brought relief to families on both sides who had waited in anguish for their loved ones. But almost everything else in Phase 1 has been contested, disputed, or simply hasn't happened. The numbers tell a troubling story. Instead of the promised 600 trucks of aid per day, Israel allowed an average of just 145 trucks daily between October 10th and November 2nd. That is less than 25% of what was agreed to. By January, that number had improved somewhat to around 255 trucks per day, but that's still only 43% of the promised amount. It's not just about the quantity of aid either. Israel has also restricted or outright blocked essential food items like meat, dairy products, and fresh vegetables, while allowing non-nutritious items like snacks and soft drinks through the crossings. More than 30 international aid organizations, including highly respected groups like Doctors Without Borders and Oxfam, have been banned from operating in Gaza, severely limiting the ability to distribute what aid does get through. Then there's the yellow line, the boundary that was supposed to clearly mark where Israeli control ended and Hamas territory began. According to multiple reports and satellite imagery analysis, Israel currently maintains a military presence in somewhere between 53% and 58% of Gaza, far more territory than was originally intended under the agreement. Palestinian officials and residents say the line keeps shifting, with Israel demolishing homes and infrastructure in areas it was supposed to have vacated. Families who tried to return to their homes in what they thought were safe areas have been shot at or turned back by Israeli soldiers. Both sides accuse each other of repeated and systematic ceasefire violations. According to Gaza's government media office, Israel violated the ceasefire at least 1,450 times between October 10, 2025 and January 31, 2026. These violations include 487 incidents of shooting at civilians who were simply trying to move around or return, 679 bombings and shellings of residential areas, 71 military raids beyond the agreed yellow line into areas that were supposed to be off-limits, and 211 incidents of deliberate property demolitions where Israeli forces destroyed Palestinian homes and buildings. The human cost of these violations has been staggering. As of early February 2026, at least 526 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces during what's supposed to be a ceasefire period, with more than 1,400 injured. Many of those killed were women and children who pose no threat to anyone. Israel tells a different story and reports its own list of 99 violations by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups during the same period. 4 Israeli soldiers have been killed since the ceasefire began. Israel says that most of its military strikes and operations have been defensive responses to militants crossing the yellow line or directly attacking its forces. Israeli officials argue they're enforcing the ceasefire agreement, not violating it, and that Hamas has failed to control other armed groups in Gaza who continue to attack. The fundamental problem is that both sides are interpreting the agreement differently, and there's no neutral enforcement mechanism that both parties trust to settle disputes. Despite all these ongoing problems and the clear gaps between promises and reality in Phase 1, on January 14, 2026, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff stood before cameras and made a surprising announcement. Speaking on behalf of President Trump, he declared the beginning of Phase 2 of the 20-point plan, saying the focus would now shift from ceasefire to demilitarization, technocratic governance, and reconstruction. For many observers, the timing seemed premature, given that Phase 1 hadn't been fully implemented. But the Trump administration pushed forward anyway, arguing that momentum needed to be maintained. Phase 2 is supposed to focus on 3 main goals, each of which is enormously ambitious and politically fraught. The first goal is demilitarization. This means that Hamas is expected to disarm and hand over its weapons, which are estimated to include thousands. Rockets of various ranges, hundreds of anti-tank missiles, mortar, and tens of thousands of assault rifles and other small arms accumulated over nearly 2 decades of rule in Gaza. For a group that has defined itself as an armed resistance movement, this would represent a fundamental transformation of its identity and role. In a significant development that suggested the U.S. understood how difficult this would be, a senior U.S. official said on January 27th that disarmament would come with some sort of amnesty for Hamas members. The idea is that fighters need assurance they will and be arrested or killed if they give up their weapons. Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, the 3 main mediators, have reportedly assured Washington that Hamas will agree to a gradual disarmament plan, though many analysts remain deeply skeptical. The second goal is establishing technocratic governance to replace Hamas's control of Gaza. On January 14th, the same day Phase 2 was announced, Egypt revealed the formation of a Palestinian technocratic government to handle day-to-day administration. This government is headed by Ali Shaath, a former deputy minister of transportation in the Palestinian Authority who has technical expertise but limited political power. The government is supposed to be separate from both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, though Palestinian officials stressed it should eventually link to the PA government in the West Bank rather than creating a permanent division between the two parts of Palestine. This government faces an almost impossible task, trying to administer a devastated territory while having no independent resources, no security force, and no clear legal authority that people recognize. The third goal is reconstruction, and the scale of what needs to be rebuilt is almost incomprehensible. The war destroyed an estimated 60% of all buildings in Gaza, including homes, schools, hospitals, water treatment plants, power infrastructure, roads, and everything else needed for modern life. The U.S. has established a civil-military coordination center led by Admiral Brad Cooper to try to facilitate humanitarian, logistical, and security assistance into Gaza. Initial plans include building pilot residential compounds, starting with a neighborhood in Rafah designed to house 20,000 Palestinians. But this is just a tiny fraction of the 1.9 million people currently displaced and living in tents, damaged buildings, or on the streets. To oversee all of this, on January 17th, the White House announced formation of the Board of Peace, an international body meant to coordinate implementation of the plan. The U.S. sent invitations to approximately 60 countries to join this board. Former UN envoy to the Middle East, Nikolay Mladenov, a Bulgarian diplomat with extensive experience in the region, will serve as the board's director and representative on the ground in Gaza. On November 17, 2025, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2803, which mandates a stabilization force for 2 years under the Board of Peace's direction. This force is supposed to help maintain security, though exactly what countries will contribute troops and what rules of engagement they'll follow remains unclear. A major milestone came on February 2, 2026, and the Rafah crossing with Egypt reopened for limited pedestrian traffic. This was the first major tangible step in Phase 2 and represents a critical lifeline for Palestinians, especially those needing medical treatment outside Gaza, where most hospitals have been destroyed or damaged beyond use. The crossing isn't fully open yet. It's only allowing certain categories of people through in limited numbers. But it's a start, and was celebrated by many as proof that Phase 2 might actually be more than just words. But even as Phase 2 officially began with announcements and international meetings, the violence on the ground didn't stop. In fact, some of the deadliest days of the entire ceasefire period have occurred in recent weeks, raising fundamental questions about whether calling this a ceasefire is even accurate anymore. February 2026 has seen a particularly troubling escalation that has shaken whatever fragile trust existed. On February 1st, Israeli strikes killed at least 30 Palestinians in locations throughout Gaza. The casualties included 2 women and 6 children from 2 different families who were killed in strikes on an apartment building in Gaza City and a makeshift tent camp in Khan Yunis, where displaced families had been sheltering. Another strike hit a police station in Gaza City, killing at least 14 people, including 4 policewomen who were simply working administrative jobs. Then on February 4th, just yesterday, Israeli strikes killed at least 23 Palestinians in one of the deadliest single days of the entire ceasefire period. Among the dead were 5 children, including a baby girl who was only 5 months old and another infant who was just 10 days old, having barely had a chance to experience life. Also killed were 7 women and a paramedic who was trying to help injured people. In the Tuffa neighborhood of Gaza City, 11 people from the same family were killed in a single strike, including 2 parents. Their 10-day-old daughter, her 5-month-old cousin, and their grandmother. Entire families wiped out in moments. Israel says these strikes were justified responses to ceasefire violations by Hamas and that it's enforcing the agreement. It's not breaking it. On February 3rd, Hamas fighters opened fire on Israeli soldiers near the Yellow Line in northern Gaza, seriously wounding 1 officer. Israel says this attack and others like it justified its retaliatory strikes. Between January 22nd and February 4th alone, Israel documented 10 separate violations by Palestinian armed groups, including militants crossing the Yellow Line, planting improvised explosive devices near Israeli positions or approaching Israeli forces in what the military considered threatening ways. The Israeli Defense Forces later issued a statement saying it regretted any harm to uninvolved individuals, but maintains that it's targeting militants who violate ceasefire, and that civilian casualties, while tragic, are the result of Hamas operating in populated areas. Hamas and Palestinian officials tell a completely different story. They say Israel is the one systematically and deliberately violating the agreement by demolishing homes and areas it should have left, according to the Yellow Line, by continuing to restrict humanitarian aid far below agreed levels, by killing civilians who are simply trying to return to their neighborhoods or move around to find food and shelter. On January 27th, Hamas issued a statement saying it had fulfilled all its obligations in a clear and responsible manner and demanded that Israel fully open the Rafah crossing without restrictions, allow all types of aid to enter without arbitrary limitations, complete its withdrawal from all areas of Gaza it was supposed to leave, and stop blocking the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza from doing its work. Senior Hamas official Bassem Naim went further, sarcastically questioning whether the international community is operating a board of war rather than a board of peace, suggesting the whole process is designed to benefit Israel while ignoring Palestinian suffering. Despite some improvements from the absolute worst days of the war, humanitarian conditions in Gaza remain absolutely catastrophic. According to the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Assessment from December, improved humanitarian access has helped offset the famine conditions that were previously declared. In parts of northern Gaza, the UN reported in January that for the first time since 2023, 100% of basic food needs in Gaza were being met, at least on paper. But the reality is far more complicated. Over 500,000 people still face emergency food security conditions, meaning they don't know where their next meal is coming from. Most of Gaza's 2.3 million residents remain displaced from their homes, living in tents, damaged buildings, or out in the open. Infrastructure is destroyed. Water and sewage systems don't work. Electricity is sporadic at best, and essential services have collapsed. As of early February, at least 250 families are living on the streets of Jabalia camp in northern Gaza without electricity, water, shops, or any basic services whatsoever. They remain not by choice, but because their homes were destroyed, and they literally have nowhere else to go. And with Israel having banned more than 30 major international aid organizations from operating in Gaza, the capacity to respond to these massive needs is severely limited. So where do things go from here? Can Phase 2 actually succeed where Phase 1 has so clearly struggled? The honest answer is that nobody really knows. But there are several major challenges that will determine whether this peace plan has any chance of working or whether it will collapse entirely. In the coming weeks and months, one immediate and practical challenge is money. Rebuilding Gaza will cost tens of billions of dollars, money that has to come from somewhere. According to a Reuters report from February 4th, countries and private donors are deeply hesitant to fund Gaza's reconstruction until there's a concrete, verifiable framework for Hamas disarmament. As one diplomatic source told Reuters, countries want to see that the funding will go to reconstruction within demilitarized places, and not just throw money into what could become another war zone in a few years. Hamas is still estimated to retain thousands of rockets and significant quantities of light arms hidden in tunnels and buildings throughout Gaza. Without real confidence that disarmament will actually happen and that weapons won't just be restocked after reconstruction, potential donors are keeping their checkbooks closed. This creates a vicious cycle. Reconstruction can't happen without money, but money won't come without disarmament. And disarmament is unlikely without reconstruction that gives people hope for a different future. Israel has also pushed back hard on several aspects of Phase 2, creating political obstacles that could derail the entire process. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government initially said it would unproceed with Phase 2 until Hamas completely and verifiably disarms and returns all remains of deceased hostages. The U.S. convinced Israel to move forward anyway, but deep tensions remain beneath the surface. Netanyahu has made his government's position crystal clear in multiple statements. The next phase is not reconstruction. The next phase is disarming Hamas and demilitarizing the Gaza Strip completely. Israel has also objected to some elements of the Board of Peace proposal, saying it wasn't properly coordinated with Israeli security officials and runs counter to established Israeli policy. Netanyahu has stated repeatedly and unequivocally that his government will not allow the creation of a Palestinian state, which raises questions about what the ultimate endgame is supposed to be, if not Palestinian sovereignty. The biggest question hanging over everything may be whether Hamas will genuinely give up its weapons. The group ruled Gaza for nearly 2 decades and has defined itself as a resistance movement fighting against Israeli occupation. Disarming would fundamentally change its identity, its role in Palestinian society, and its reason for existing. The U.S. proposal for some sort of amnesty suggests American officials recognize that Hamas members need guarantees of safety if they are going to lay down arms, but the details of what amnesty would mean remain extremely vague. Would it protect Hamas fighters from Israeli arrest or assassination? Would it allow former Hamas officials to participate in the new technocratic government? Would it prevent prosecution for attacks during the war? None of this has been clearly spelled out. And given the ongoing Israeli strikes, the continuing restrictions on movement and aid, and the fact that Israel still controls most of Gaza's territory, some analysts question whether Hamas has any real incentive to disarm while it still faces what it perceives as existential threats to its survival and to the Palestinian people it claims to represent. Perhaps most fundamentally, there's a massive trust deficit on all sides that makes any agreement incredibly fragile. Palestinians see Israel continuing to kill civilians, including babies and young children, continuing to restrict humanitarian aid far below promised levels, and maintaining military control over most of their territory despite supposed ceasefire commitments. They ask a simple question: why should we believe Phase 2 will be any different from Phase 1? What reason do we have to think promises will be kept this time when they weren't kept before? Israelis, on the other hand, point to continued Hamas attacks on their soldiers, 2 rockets and weapons they say are still hidden throughout Gaza, and to what they see as a group that has never truly accepted Israel's right to exist. They ask their own questions. How can we trust a group that still launches attacks on our forces to actually disarm? How do we know this isn't just a pause to regroup before the next war? And the international community is caught in the middle. It's trying to mediate between parties who fundamentally don't trust each other, don't trust the process, and have very different visions of what peace should look like. So here's where the Gaza ceasefire talks actually stand in February 2026. Phase 1 did achieve some of its most important goals. The hostages came home to their families after months or even years in captivity. Thousands of Palestinian prisoners were released from Israeli detention and reunited with their loved ones. Humanitarian aid increased significantly from the extremely low levels during the height of the war. These were real accomplishments that brought relief to real families on both sides of this conflict. But Phase 1 also fell dramatically short on many of its key promises. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed during what's supposed to be a ceasefire period. Aid restrictions continue, with only about half of the promised 600 trucks entering Gaza daily. Israeli forces still control more than half of Gaza's territory. Both sides continue to accuse each other of repeated violations, creating a cycle of blame and retaliation that shows no signs of ending. Phase 2 has now officially begun, and on paper it looks promising. A Palestinian technocratic government has been announced to take over day-to-day administration. The Rafah crossing with Egypt reopened on February 2nd, providing a critical lifeline for medical evacuations and essential supplies. International structures like the Board of Peace are being put in place to oversee the process. The United Nations has authorized a stabilization force, but the fundamental challenges that plagued Phase 1 haven't gone away. Can Hamas actually be convinced to disarm and give up the weapons that have defined its identity for 2 decades? Will Israel fully withdraw from Gaza when it still sees security threats? Can reconstruction begin while strikes and violence continue almost daily? Will countries and donors actually provide the billions needed to rebuild when they unsure whether Gaza will remain demilitarized? The honest answer is that nobody really knows. Some analysts have described this ceasefire as a ceasefire in name only, a managed reduction in violence rather than actual peace. For the 2.3 million residents of Gaza living in tents, struggling to find food and clean water, watching their children grow up amid rubble and trauma, the distinction between war and ceasefire has become almost meaningless. They're still displaced from their homes. They're still living under the constant threat of strikes. They're still unable to rebuild their lives. The international community points to the reduced violence compared to the height of the war and calls it progress. And perhaps in relative terms, it is. But whether this fragile framework can actually deliver lasting peace, genuine security, and normal life remains a completely open question. What's absolutely clear is that the coming weeks and months will be critical. Watch carefully for whether disarmament negotiations make real progress or stall completely. Watch whether humanitarian aid finally flows at the levels that were promised. Watch whether the Board of Peace gains actual authority and legitimacy or becomes just another ineffective. And most importantly, watch whether the violence finally stops or continues to claim lives on both sides. The ceasefire may technically be hanging by a thread, but turning this tenuous pause in the fighting into actual lasting peace will require far more courage, compromise, and commitment than anything we've seen so far from any of the parties involved.